it's really important that we teach learning professionals how to use data, how to connect to the business, how to define the learning objectives that are going to get at the business need or business pain point, and then tell the story of what happened, what changed, what's better, what didn't get better. Because without that, it's just an evolving machine.
Well, thanks for tuning in to this episode of LearnOps Leadership. Today, we have the pleasure of meeting with Martha Soehren. And thanks, Martha, for joining us.
Ryan, it's an absolute pleasure being with you today. I'm very intrigued and interested in what you're doing and sharing my thoughts on the topic.
Thanks. So we're really excited to have you here. The whole purpose of the LearnOps Leadership Series is just trying to put more emphasis and focus around the operations side of L&D. You and I talked earlier about treating L&D like a business and how there needs to be more focus around that. And we're trying to just educate the industry to let them know that, everybody has their challenges with the operational side. There's a lot of problems to unwind, and how we can innovate more in this area to progress the industry forward. We always try and talk about everybody's story. I find that when talking to L&D leaders, for the most part, people fall into L&D. I don't think that's so much for your case. I believe that you actually went to school and studied this, right? Tell us a little bit about your story.
I'll try to make it short for you, Ryan, because it's a long story. I've been in learning and development about 35 to 40 years. I got my foray into learning and development when I was working for the Army as a Department of Army civilian. And as a management analyst, very much like industrial engineering, it's what we call it in the business world. One of my primary responsibilities was to validate the programs of instruction for the soldiers to ensure that they had a healthy, safe learning environment. So I would make sure they had the right number of instructors for the practical exercises or the training content. And so that was my introduction, but I had a goal of leading learning and business for quite a few years. And so when I made the pivot from the Army to Comcast, it was absolutely my goal to lead learning. And I did start a degree at year 23 out of my 25 years with the Army. I started a degree in educational leadership and policy studies to better prepare me to be that leader in corporate America. And it worked out beautifully for me. And I was an adjunct professor for about 13 years. That helped as well. But at the end of the day, I had the best job in the place. Leading learning is a fabulous, fabulous role and I would say career.
No, I agree. It's that's amazing. How did you even come across the opportunity with Comcast?
Oh, wow. That's a crazy story, Ryan. And I would almost think that you know the answer to that to ask the question. Because looking back, it probably was a little risky. But when I was preparing to make my pivot, I went on Monster.com. Do you even remember Monster.com?
I do.
I looked for roles that fit what it was I wanted to do, because with the Army, I didn't necessarily have all of the right job titles that existed in corporate America. And I applied for one job at Comcast. It was leading leadership development for one of its geographical divisions. So I applied for that job. 8 months, 13 interviews later, I took the job.
That's amazing.
We're better at that now with the recruiting arm of things.
That's a great story. Thanks for sharing. And I would love to learn about, so you came into that position leading a department and eventually over years became the Chief Talent Development Officer at Comcast. And from my understanding before then, you led the L&D function before you had other people leading the L&D function within your teams. So would love to understand, when you came into the role, when you first moved into more of a management layer for L&D, and then ultimately into the Chief Talent Development Officer role. And the reason I'm asking is just to really help people understand the decisions that are made when coming into it from a department. So maybe being part of a federated model and leading a department, and then growing more into that management layer and ultimately into a centralized layer where you have more oversight so that we can learn about the operational decisions that end up funneling into leading L&D like a business?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I have a two-part answer to that. One is, when taking on any leadership role, it's really important that you understand the people, the processes, and the technology that you are inheriting and you're about to engage in. And just really understanding how those work, how they work together, and how they work separately. That's part one. Part two is becoming a student of the business and making sure that all of your team members become students of the business. Because at the end of the day, the learning function is there to support the business and doing a better job of serving the customer and serving the stakeholders and making a profit. And so if you're not engaged in understanding the different functions and the different operations that you're supporting from a learning perspective, it's really, really hard to be successful. When I centralized learning at Comcast, I established a learning council to be my strategic partner because I knew how important the business side of things were and are. And so I had the CEO of the cable business, the CHRO, I had the product owners, I had the presidents of the divisions sitting on the council with me to ensure that we were doing what was right for the business. Now, that's a long story, but you can't separate the two. You have to understand what it is you're working with, and then also become a student and a steward of the business.
That's really interesting. So the council almost worked as this advisory board. Is that accurate statement?
That's correct. The strategic partner. And initially we met 4 times a year. We met quarterly. But as we progressed, we got to the point where really at the end of the day, because we were so ingrained in the business, we only needed to meet prior to budget development and then after budget approval. In other words, here's what we're aligned with strategically to support the business. Does this work as you're going into budgets? And then when the budget is approved, if you have any gaps, then that's the time where you talk about what those gaps are. But I will say to you, Ryan, that there were a few times where I didn't necessarily get all of the budget I wanted. But one of the really cool and wonderful things about the Comcast leadership is they would always come through if there was a business need that required a learning solution that wasn't in my budget for the year. They would come through with the money that was needed to make it happen. I never, ever felt shortchanged from a budget perspective because they so truly believed in learning and development.
That's amazing. And was that more of a Comcast cultural thing, or was it because you set up the learning function where there was visibility into business cases that helped to support the additional budget as needed when needed?
I think it's a little bit of both. When I took the role as Chief Talent Development Officer, there was not a centralized budget. There wasn't a centralized team. And so through a year-long planning process and presenting the business case for a centralized learning function, I was also able to get a centralized budget, which was fabulous for the first time, because sometimes without that, we're holding people accountable for what they're not responsible, right? And that's a strong statement. You want to be accountable for what you are responsible for getting done. And so it made it really easy to pull the budget together for the enterprise and then just allocate it back out as an expense to each of the business departments and entities. It worked beautifully.
With the advisory board that you set up and the committee, that would help to provide a feedback loop so that you could build the budget in a central way, but still be able to support the other departments and the performance needs there as well. Is that right?
That's right. And to get at part 2 of your question, which I didn't go there, one of the things that helped tremendously is the fact that at those meetings, the council meetings, we presented business impact stories around learning solutions. We made it our goal to tell an impact story or two, sometimes more, at each of the meetings, so we could show that we talked about this particular learning solution. You gave us the money to build it. We were very connected with the business pain point or the business need up front. So therefore, we were able to collect the data and measure. And here's your story of how that worked. And more often than not, it was a success story at the end of the day. I think, Ryan, that one of the business aspects that so many learning organizations struggle with is connecting a learning solution to a business problem and getting stakeholder sign off right up front. And, that's part of the business operations within L&D. Having a business partner to sign off that, yes, this is what we need. Yes, this is what we tend to solve. Yes, this is what we expect the employee to do differently after they consume this learning and they practice and so forth. It's really important that we teach learning professionals how to use data, how to connect to the business, how to define the learning objectives that are going to get at the business need or business pain point, and then tell the story of what happened, what changed, what's better, what didn't get better. Because without that, it's just an evolving machine.
No, I agree. I mean, that's something that we're very focused on at Synapse, is trying to help these L&D teams tell the story on impact and use the data to do that. So it's a really hard problem to actually solve. And one of the luxuries of being in L&D as a technology company is working with so many L&D teams. And we still see a lot of people struggling to do this well. And in fact, we still hear people say, well, we're trying to get this infrastructure in place to tell our story so that we can also have a seat at the C-suite or whatnot to help show the impact. And you've done all of this, which is amazing, right? What were some of the building blocks to get there? Because talking about putting data together around business problems and that you hear from the advisory board, tied to budget and ultimately tied to impact, and be able to tell a story, I mean, that's not easy. What were some of the building blocks and lessons learned around the way to get there for you?
There were a few. One was a dedicated effort to teach learning and development professionals how to use data. We had physical classes in the classroom to teach them, and we gave them opportunities to practice. And then we made it a requirement that at least twice a year, those almost 700 learning and development professionals shared impact stories. So with that as a backdrop, Ryan, a couple of things. One is, early on, we built a dashboard, and I called it our transactional dashboard. And most learning organizations has one of these. And what I really love about Synapse and what you're doing is that you're going to build a simple, easy digital way for folks to build that transactional scorecard. Without the transactional data, it's hard to get at the impact data. So you need both. So operationally, build the transactional scorecard so that you have the numerators and the denominators for what you need to get at that return on investment. I love calling it impact stories rather than ROI. I think it resonates. It gets away from the edge you speak when we're dealing with our leaders. But we really, really need both. And as part of that, we need to ensure that during our scoping process, we've asked all of the right questions. We have all of the right information. We know where the data is going to come from. That was one of our biggest issues early on, Ryan, was who the heck owns the business data for process A or process B or, process A.1.2.3. It was just really, really, really hard to get a handle on the data. So any way of refining how information comes together for learning professionals is a good thing. And it's not just about the learning data. It's about how the function of program management around a learning solution is managed. How do we make that more simple and easier and more digital so that it's really painless because what I found was I had painful processes for my team members for, the longest time. And there's still some of those painful processes. People do not want to sit and enter data, minute after minute or hour after hour when they don't really feel that the data is going to be used to really measure a difference. And we did a lot of that. So, I always like to ask, what is the value added in this piece of information that I'm entering into a program management or a project management database or form, those kind of things?
Yeah, that makes sense. And we've seen from other L&D teams that, keeping it simple and easy, that statement, I think that Burson came up with a long time ago about in the flow of work. That's not just for learning, it's also for the learning function to enter the data. And if it's not in the flow of the work, it probably means that it doesn't necessarily need to be there, right? Because a lot of the times when getting into data and analytics, you can go way off into the deep end, and it just makes it harder to tell the story ultimately as well.
Yeah, well said. That learning professional needs to know what's in it for me. If I enter this data point, what is in it for me when, as a professional, when I tell my story about what it is I've done, what it is that I do?
Did you do anything on teaching people to tell stories? One of my favorite books is Tell to Win, which is all about learning how to tell stories. I know that you set up train the trainer sessions in regards to the data side of things, but how about on storytelling? Because that's a skill on its own.
We integrated the two. And the way that happened was I would role model how to tell a story using data. And I would let my team members practice telling stories using their data. And we would give feedback in each and every case. Every other month, we would have an open forum, a virtual open forum, because we were all across the US. And in that open forum, we called it our Impact Story webinar. And any of the L&D professionals could sign up ahead of time, come on and tell their data story from something that they had actually built from a real learning solution, from analysis all the way to evaluation. And they would do that for the purpose of friendly, helpful, kind feedback on how they had developed and built that story. Storytelling is really, really important. I was with a group of executive ladies just this week, and I did a seminar for them, and I told a lot of stories. And Ryan, people will remember our stories long after they forget all of that other stuff we talk about.
I mean, as humans, we're born with stories in mind. Some of the best memories I have are from my childhood, and I don't even remember how I know them, or remember those, but it's just part of the story process. And I think that stories are ingrained in all humans, and if you can use that as a platform to tell stories effectively, it's very powerful. So on the L&D operational side of things, the strategy that you're talking about makes a lot of sense to me. We're seeing a lot of teams still to date trying to do this. One of the challenges that we come across at Synapse is L&D teams using disparate tools, which breaks the data flow to be able to tell the story. It makes it really hard to capture the data. What are some of the lessons learned on your end to get the data from all the different places to flow up to eventually be able to tell a story on impact?
Yeah, so 2 lessons learned for me. One was I empowered the vice presidents on my team to make their decisions around the software tools and data collection tools that they use. Big mistake. I should have gotten myself engaged at the table and really narrowed down the number of solutions they were actually using. So that is what I would do differently around that kind of decision making, because it didn't help us in the way that I did it. And I think the other, around the tools, and the other would probably be just ensuring that I was role modeling and doing what was right for them.
And did you ever run into challenges? I mean, this may have been easier for you than other teams that we see because you had a seat at the C-suite. Do you ever run in with challenges with IT saying, well, we have this enterprise-wide software, why not just use that?
Absolutely. Smart Sheets might be one of those, if I can say that on this video. And there are many, many others, many forms of project management software. And, and we did progress nicely with Smart Sheets, but I think there's a better solution. I think there's something that can really bring the simple, easy digital to life.
And moving forward, do you think that technology is the answer to solving this at scale for L&D professionals? Or, I mean, earlier you said systems, people, technology. What do you think the industry needs to do to solve this at scale where learning and development can tell their story, show the impact, and treat learning and development like a business?
Yeah, Ryan, I think it's a little bit of education and a lot of technology. A lot of technology changes and a lot of technology improvements, especially along the simplification route. Because I believe that efficiency and effectiveness in L&D operations is really critical to the success of the learning organization, the reputation of the learning organization. And the better that we build the technology and the software, the easier that whole piece is going to be.
I guess the last question I have for you today, Martha, if you were to, give feedback to an audience that's trying to figure this out and really be able to help set up this infrastructure and strategy for their organizations, what would you summarize 3 things to focus on to get started?
So one would be understand what it is that you're solving for. Pick a great, outstanding vendor partner to work with you to either build that solution or fill. It could be fill, F-I-L, the solution. And the third is just make sure that in all that you're doing, that you're really connected with the business partners so that your vendor partner and your L&D professionals can make all of the connections they need with all of the different data sources. And it's not likely that the business data sources are going to change because those are managed by the business. But how can you better integrate what you're getting from your business partners into a single source of truth? And that's what I would hope for learning and development professionals, a single source of truth to go to for what it is that you need to tell your business impact story.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your story, Martha. This was really insightful and really excited to share this with the industry so that they can learn from you as well. Thank you.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Thanks for tuning in to the series. For more information and content on LearnOps, please like, share, and subscribe. Visit getsynapse.com to learn more about our operations platform.